Blessings, everyone. This is sort of the continuation of a series that I wanted to do where I do some reviews or discussions of films that I like. Last time it was The Robe, and this time it's going to be The Eagle from 2011. I did want to warn people that these reviews have spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film and you want to be surprised by the plot, then maybe don't watch these until you've seen the movie. So let's take a deep dive into The Eagle. Okay, like The Robe, the previous movie I discussed, The Eagle is based on a novel. Here's a one sheet for the movie. It starred Channing Tatum as Marcus and Jamie Bell as Eska. So let's see. It is in that genre, I have to say before I go on, it is in that genre, I'd say, of the historical epic, not really the biblical epic, which Quo Vadis, began and I talked about, and that leads into The Robe, the Ten Commandments, and Ben-Hur and all those films. It's the historical epic, maybe more like Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, or the more recent Gladiator with Ridley Scott, but it's still in that genre of film, so it's a bit of a throwback. And like I said, the film is based on a novel. The author was Rosemary Sutcliffe. She was a female English author. The book was published in 1954. She was disabled for much of her life. She never married, but she is in that great tradition of famous female English novelists who we all know many, but also of the English historical epic novel. And I did read the book, the Eagle of the Ninth, and it did remind me a bit of maybe like Sir Walter Scott, who did similar type of books, oftentimes based on historical events in and around, England. I didn't want to talk about where this book is correct or incorrect, or the movie is correct or incorrect about what actually happened to the Ninth Legion. Um, in Scotland, I more wanted to talk about the film, so you could get more into the historical aspects. I mean, someone else could do that a better job. Rosemary Sutcliffe, was a successful author. This book went into a series about the family from The Eagle of the Ninth, and then she did Arthurian novels. A near contemporary of her is Rumer Godden, who's also an English um, female author. Her most famous book is probably Black Narcissus, about a group of Anglican nuns who set up a monastery in the Himalayas, and I want to talk about that in a little bit. The author of The Eagle is Kevin MacDonald. He's Scottish, so I think he has a good feeling for Scotland, the atmosphere, the land, the people, and you see that in the film, which mainly takes place in Scotland. And the cinematography, I think, is beautiful, and it's very evocative of a certain time and place. In that aspects, the movie is like super successful. He comes from an illustrious filmmaking family. His grandfather was Emmerich Pressburger, who film buffs might remember from Pressburger and Powell. So Michael Powell was also an English director, and they worked together. Uh, I guess primarily during the 40s and 50s, and The Red Shoes is a very famous film that they made, and also Black Narcissus, which I have a couple of pictures from. It's a very beautiful film. The cinematography is incredible. These matte paintings are incredible. Um, I got really, sort of as an aside, a little detour, I really got into this movie in the 1990s when I first saw it. And because I was very much interested in medieval spirituality and art and religion. And this movie, I think, touches upon those aspects, although it's not in the Middle Ages. It doesn't take place in the Middle Ages at all. But I think it does, I think, look at certain aspects of especially female spirituality, which was very important in the Middle Ages in terms of Western Catholic mysticism. Um, and you see it in this movie where it often tips that sort of that that can tip into a sort of hysteria. And I think you see that in the movie very, very clearly. I think I have one more picture from Black Narcissus. Yeah, I'd recommend it. It's a beautiful looking film, but it's also just an interesting plot uh, and story too. Okay, back to to the Eagle. This movie, I think, relates well with the Robe, which I talked about, because in the Robe I focused on the relationship between the father and the son. Unlike in the Robe, where Richard Burton, who played Marcellus, his father is still living, Senator Gallio, and there's that conflict between them. Channing Tatum, who plays Marcus, his father is deceased, and he has spent most of his life not knowing his dad. Although probably the most powerful scenes in the movie are Marcus repeatedly has these flashbacks of his father. So his memories are not complete. They're often little snippets, very symbolic, very surrealistic little vignettes of with his father, usually in full military dress, leaving, presumably to their destruction, when the Ninth Legion disappeared. And oftentimes his father is seen handing Marcus this little, I don't know what you'd call this little figurine or this little statue of the eagle, the Roman imperial eagle, which is the standard for all the legions of Rome. It's this symbolic. It's the symbol of the particular legion, but also of Rome itself, and it's like the power and the strength and the ability of that Roman idea is distilled or embodied in that symbol, which isn't just a symbol, but it's an actual object. So that plays a big part in the film. So really, the shadow of Marcus's dead father uh, is throughout this movie because Marcus's father is blamed for the disappearance of the Ninth Legion and for its destruction. It reminds me of the it reminds me of these other stories where the shadow of the father casts casts over the son, and especially like in Shakespeare's Hamlet, that's very clear. It's also in Gladiator, if you remember, Joaquin Phoenix, who plays Commodus, and his father is the great Marcus Aurelius, and his the shadow of his great father sort of destroys the son, who is, I mean, not just mediocre, but sadistic. It's also in a movie that I like in another book. It's called Third Man on the Mountain. I think I mentioned it in my review of The Rogue, um, where the son of a famous alpine mountain climber dies, and that death and sort of the greatness of his father casts a shadow over the son, who eventually, redeems the father and everybody, and even himself. And I think you see this with Marcus, and Marcus is really focused when he picks his assignment, which is in England, which are Britannia, to redeem his father's name and his family's name, and that's really what he's trying to do for the most part, because, like I said, his father's been blamed for the disappearance of the Ninth Legion. This is also an interesting kind of Western motif. You've seen it in a lot of Westerns where the father is somehow disgraced, and then the son later comes back and tries to redeem his father and his father's name. So it you see this motif over and over again. It was interesting in the very beginning of the near beginning of the movie. There's a scene where Marcus is kneeling at an altar and worshiping. And I could tell from there's very good attention to detail in this movie. I could tell that that was he was worshiping at an altar of Mithras, and Mithras was this sort of it was a male only cult that became very popular in Rome about the same time that Christianity was also taking hold in the Roman Empire. And it's interesting because the Mithras cult included these very complex initiation rituals. I think they were very attractive, to men, especially soldiers. And the Mithras cult had a large uh, following among the Roman army. But also, you can also see this in when he's worshiping his ancestors. So there's that very important part of his religious life too, despite from the Mithras cult, also the worship of his ancestors, and more specifically his father. So Marcus shows up at this outpost in Britannia or Britain, and the men there are not particularly happy with his arrival because they see it as a bad sign, as a bad omen, because this is the son of the man who lost the Ninth Legion, and entire legions were not lost very often. That it happened once before up in Gaul during the reign of Emperor Augustus. So we're talking over 100 years before. So it was a pretty rare occurrence. So they weren't really happy with him. Here he is until there's a decisive battle, and Marcus really proves himself more than capable, really heroic. There's a great scene in there where the phalanx, which is that was a I was kind of thinking of it as like a turtle, where the Roman legions a Roman army would create their shields into a sort of box on the sides and on the top. And it worked great in very flat terrain, like in the Middle East or here. It didn't work so well in guerrilla warfare. That was kind of the Achilles heel of the Roman army. But I think they did that really well on the battle scene was excellent. But just you also see right away this contrast between civilization and barbarism. And it's not just implied, it's pretty implicit in the movie that uh, at least in their mind, in the minds of the Romans and in the minds of Marcus, the Romans embody civilization, and the barbarians or the Britons are the chaos of barbarism. It's sort of the West versus the rest of the world, and I think that's very much takes on concrete form with Hadrian's Wall, which plays a part in the movie where there was an actual physical separation between the world of barbarism and the world of Roman civilization. Okay, so despite Marcus's heroism, he is injured. And I want to talk a little bit about Channing Tatum here. I think he's a good actor. I'm not familiar with a lot of his work. I did look at his filmography. It seems like he's particularly famous for this series of movies, Magic Mike, that he did about male strippers, which is he did do a really interesting movie called Dog, where he was actually I think he was the director and the producer, and it was where he played an army ranger. So I think when he is given good material, I think like most actors, when the material is good, when the foundation is good, the screenplay and the directing is proficient, that they will do well. And I think he's a good actor. And I think it's too bad he hasn't been given more chances. He's very likable, I think, as an actor. He reminds me of Joel McCrea, who was one of my favorite actors from the golden age of Hollywood. And I think if Channing Tatum had been in that era, you know, 60, 70 years ago, he could have been in Westerns, but he also could have been in sort of interesting, more social comedies like Sullivan's Travels that Joel McCrea did. It's just unfortunate the quality of films is not good. I think Madonna's had that same problem, is that I think she was made fun of as an actress, but I think when given good material, like in Evita, she's a good actor, good actress. Okay, back to the film. So he is injured, and he goes to live with his uncle, he goes to live with his uncle, who's played by Donald Sutherland. It's a small part, but it's a good part, and he's good in everything he does. He can make a smaller part and it's just something great. And so during his sickness, of course, he has flashbacks to his father. And when he's well enough, he attends a sort of gladiatorial combat tournament, whatever you want to call it. And there he sees Eska, played by Jamie Bell. Jamie Bell's probably most remembered for the film that he did when he was young. What was the name of that movie? He's probably most well known for Billy Elliot, which was that's an interesting movie because there's a strong father son dynamic in that film as well, but he's older here, of course, and Esk is actually about to be slain by this gladiator, and Marcus steps in to save him. So Marcus's uncle purchases Esk as a slave for Marcus because Marcus is, going to need help just in terms of physical help, in terms of his rehabilitation. So this is the scene that I was talking about during the gladiatorial combat, and I think Marcus saw a certain nobility in Eska, who's sort of unwilling to fight, who's sort of unwilling to take part in this sick form of entertainment. There's a really cool scene in the movie where Marcus has to be his leg has to be the leg that he injured the wound has to be reopened, and the doctor tells Eska to hold him down, and there's this very interesting scene in the movie where he's holding him down, and it's quite powerful. I think this connection that they have from the beginning. And I read some contemporary reviews and discussions about it, and it was seen as homoerotic by some people, and I think that's the problem that movies like this have. You saw it with Ben-Hur, with Charlton Heston and Stephen Boyd, with those two characters. Not at the time, I would say, but in the sort of revisionism that takes place. And, some critics have seen that as a homosexual relationship. And I think the problem is, especially in our culture, Western culture, that is so saturated with these ideas of sexual orientation, that some people have a hard time comprehending a strong male bond between two men that is fully masculine and in no way homosexual. And I think that's the case in this film. I mean, that's what I see. Again, I don't know what revisionists, either involved in the film or not, are saying later, but I think that is implicit in the movie, that it's a strong masculine, a very warrior-based relationship that these two men have. It's not explored that often in film. It used to be much more because you had specifically Westerns, and I would say war movies, where men were put in difficult, violent situations where they had to rely on each other. And I think that's goes part and parcel with this movie. I think there's kind of a turning point in the film where Marcus's uncle has some guests, presumably from Rome, and I think it's a senator and his son. The son is sort of a buffoon, and I think not knowing who Marcus is or his family background or who his father was says something about the loss of the Ninth Legion. And I think that sort of family dishonor that's happened to him gets smacked in the face once again. And he decides to go north past Hadrian's Wall to see what happened to the Ninth Legion, but most specifically to find the eagle, the standard that was lost, and return that to Rome. It's his quest for redemption for his father and his family name. I like Star Trek. I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm a Trekker or a Trekkie, but I like the Next Generation, and there's some other plot lines in the Star Trek universe that I like. I like the one with Enterprise, that one as well, because there's a strong father-son dynamic in that, because the captain in Enterprise was also sort of involved with trying to redeem his father, who was I'm getting into some, sorry, I'm getting into some detours, but in that plot line, the father was one of the first, or the first human, or not the first, but one of the first humans to work on like warp drive. And I think he had some serious obstacles about getting that off the ground and working in space. And his son, early as the first captain of a starship from Earth, tried to redeem his father. So you see that in the Star Trek universe. You saw it in one of my favorite characters was Worf, Lieutenant Worf, who's a Klingon, and his family was dishonored because his father was supposedly a traitor. So this long, very long plot line dealing with him and trying to redeem his family and father's name. So the Eagle is very much in within that genre again of the son uh, seeking redemption for his father, who's been wrongly accused of either being a traitor or a coward. Now, Eska has his own family background. His father was killed by the Romans, and Marcus has this small figurine of the eagle that his father gave him, and Eska has his father's knife, which he keeps with him. So they both have this strong attachment to their father, but also that's sort of centered on a symbol. So the two of them journey north of Hadrian's Wall, which is sort of, which I talked about before, which is leaving the civilized Roman world and going into this world of barbarism, north into Scotland. And there's a lot of beautiful scenes in that section of the film. I'm going to speed through much of the film. I can't go into super great detail, or I'll be here all day. But they do come across one of the missing legionnaires who survived uh, the attack on the Ninth Legion, the destruction of the Ninth Legion, and just sort of decided to stay in Scotland and blend in with the native population. And this man married a native woman, had children, and sort of became a Scot himself. And that's an interesting scene because Eska's involved with it too, because of course Marcus would have an interpretation, or his impression of this guy would be as somebody who was abandoned the Roman army, was a deserter. That's an interesting scene with the deserter from the Ninth Legion, who, instead of, I guess, returning to Rome or returning to Britannia, decided to stay there in Scotland, and married a native woman, had children there, that he's seen as dishonored and dishonorable, and also by Eska too, as a deserter. But he'll reappear later in the film. And it's interesting because he does at least guide them along the way to where the eagle is. And it's supposedly with these seal people even further north. There's shades of Apocalypse Now in this movie too, which was based on Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. They keep going sort of deeper and deeper into this barbarous world, or into the as in Apocalypse Now, into the jungle further up the river, or these guys further into the highlands, and it sort of becomes darker and stranger the farther they go. So they do encounter the seal people, and what's most noticeable about them is the young warriors. It's a young warrior society, and they're all covered in as sort of this mud, I guess. In order to conceal the fact that Marcus is a Roman, Esca plays the role of owning him as his master, and they sort of switch identities there for a while, which is interesting to see how that plays out. So Esca and Marcus go to their village uh, in on the northern shores of Scotland and discover that indeed that's where the eagle is. There's some really interesting parts of this movie that take place in that village where this warrior society, they have these initiation rituals, and you see these all male initiation rituals that used seemed like they used some sort of hallucinogenic agent. So that aspect of pre-modern culture always interested me because it seemed like in the post-industrial West, men and specifically boys seem to have so much, or young men seem to have specifically so much trouble, is because they lost these sort of male initiation ritual cultures that you see if they have survived in indigenous peoples, but not in the West. So then you have sort of their feeble replacements, which is, I mean, it's most clearly evident in like urban gang culture, but just also in the use of drugs, pornography, obsessions with video games, and then just sort of this failure to launch phenomena where a lot of young men refuse to marry or don't marry until very late and then don't have children. So there's just this failure of fatherhood, but also just a failure of young men to launch into adulthood as men. There's also a pretty rough scene where Eska has befriended one of the boys in the village, and he finds out about him and Marcus leaving after they had recaptured or taken the Eagle, the Standard, and Eska lets the boy go, which is sort of against. There was a scene earlier in the film where you just don't let people go that have seen you, because then they can go back and report your location and who you are and what you're doing. And Eska lets him go, and then later in the film the boy reappears with one of the warriors of the seal people, and he's murdered in front of them. It's an unpleasant part of the movie, but it sort of shows how warrior societies, these all male warrior societies, can descend very quickly into savagery, sort of into something like the Lord of the Flies, but also in more subtle ways where you saw this in modern culture with specifically like male homosexuality and gay male communities that fell into pretty hardcore promiscuity, especially in the 70s and into the 80s. And then you had the rise of AIDS, which was just brutal, sort of savage massacre that happened. So Marcus and Eska escape, but then they're sort of trapped in this gorge, this river. It's complicated, but Marcus decides to stay with the eagle because his injuries been aggravated, and Eska leaves, presumably to save his own life. But as we see later, he actually comes back with help. This idea of the last stand is interesting and sort of masculine and a masculine sort of mythos. You saw it in at Thermopylae with the 300 Spartans in the movie 300, or in an earlier film, which I really like, the 300 Spartans with Richard Egan, but also just in like American history with the Alamo. So this has a long history, the idea of the last stand, and this is it. And he's willing to take these warriors on by himself, which is a lost cause, but he's willing to do it. Now, just as all seems lost, this is another great scene in the film. And Eska arrives with the legionnaire that they had met earlier, but there was actual other survivors from the Ninth Legion who continued to live in Scotland, and they all show up with their old tattered armor, and they form this last stand against the Seal people. And at this point, it's really not about civilization and barbarism. It's about personal redemption. And with that redemption, for Marcus, it includes his father, but with these lost legionnaires, it's also just the redemption of everything that happened, that their desertion and their guilt over surviving that massacre. And it's a way to redeem themselves. This is the best battle scene in the film. There isn't a ton, and it's really great. It's really good. Okay, there's one really interesting scene in uh at the end of the battle. So the young man, the warrior who is the presumed leader of the SEAL warriors. So he dies and his face is submerged in the flowing water of this river. And Marcus is holding his head under the water. And at that point, his sort of face comes back up and reemerges without the makeup. And it just looks like a completely different person. And I thought that was like a really cool, interesting way to reveal sort of the human story or the human individual behind the warrior and their story. And I just thought that was cool because I think it also showed the vulnerability that you saw in Marcus, but also Eska as they went on that journey together. And in this way, it happened, of course, tragically just in death. So Marcus and Eska retrieve, of course, the eagle. They survive the battle with the Seal people, and they're able to return to Britannia. Before that, there's also another great scene at the end of the battle where most of the lost legionnaires from the ninth are killed, and he has set up a funeral pyre because Romans did not bury their dead; they typically burned them. And so the one legionnaire that they had first met and gotten to know and who had helped them is burned on this funeral pyre, and Marcus places the statuette, the figurine of the eagle that his father had given him, and Eska places the knife from his father. So it's the resolution of that conflict with these two men, specifically that Marcus had with his father. So he returns to Britannia. This is another great scene, and places the eagle in front of the senator, and he just walks in, puts it down, and leaves, and that's it. It's kind of over. It's almost like he is a bit disgusted. Like I think he gets why the legionnaires who survived the ninth decided to remain in Scotland. They sort of they were no longer as convinced of sort of the Roman idea as they were. There's an interesting scene earlier in the film with that lost legionnaire where they're talking about why Rome had to keep pushing and pushing into these areas where they didn't need to be, and they weren't wanted and they weren't welcomed. And so you kind of see that in Marcus at this point, that he's not as convinced of strength and honor and all those things that really motivated him and drove him are not as important anymore as they used to be. And almost kind of felt like they were setting up a sequel at the end of this. And I wish they could have, because it would have been kind of cool to see, what these two guys, what adventures they could have gone into. But of course, the film, didn't do that well. So I hope you enjoyed that deep dive into the Eagle. I really like the movie. I don't know if it's a great film. I think it's close. I think it's better than The Robe because one of the main issues I had with The Robe were the two male protagonists. I don't think the relationship there was sort of central to the story in many ways because Marcellus gave up his life for his slave, but it wasn't really explored very well, and you could never really figure out why he would because it wasn't fleshed out. But I think in this movie, I think that relationship between the two guys is really fully explored, and you see that to why they connect in an important way. And I think it's cool because you don't see uh, sort of a buddy adventure film like you used to see in Westerns. You just don't see it anymore. So I'm glad that they picked it back up in this movie, although it's 12, 13 years old at this point. So let's hope they make more movies like The Eagle. Bye bye. God bless you.